All right, 30-second transition from being a parent who's first just graduated to being your pastor. I'm ready to be here. I'm ready for it. Hey, well, you guys are awesome. We have learned how to be anxious about everything and how to be anxious even about nothing, haven't we? I mean, at least nothing that we can always put our finger on. It's one thing to be anxious about something and you know what it is, but have you ever felt yourself being anxious and you don't even know why? I'm just anxious. Anybody? And you don't always have to have something specific or tangible in order to experience anxiety. We've learned how to be anxious about everything and even how to be anxious about nothing. Anxiety, for so many of us, has become a close and constant companion. In fact, some of us would not even recognize our own lives if anxiety was absent from that life. But guys, through this teaching series, we're not trying to eradicate all anxiety from planet Earth. No, we've been way more interested in how do we make sure that our anxiety doesn't control us or paralyze our lives. Because here's the thing. I don't want my anxiety or your anxiety to keep us from the abundant life that Jesus promised to give us. But I think for too many of us, if I can let you in on a secret, my observations, which have a lot of data and experience, if I can let you in on a secret, so many of us are allowing our anxiety to rob us of the life Jesus came to give us. And one of the reasons our church exists is to fight back against the kind of dominant statements of our world and of our culture so that you can know what you feel is most true might not be most true. And what you hear out there is most true might not be most true. And so what we want to do is lean into Jesus' truth to know that once we know the truth, his promise is, then we would be set free by that very truth that we embrace. So if we're going to get in on the life God has for us and not be paralyzed or controlled by our anxiety, we have to answer this question. What are we supposed to do with our anxiety? What are we supposed to do with our anxiety? And if you don't know this, here's what I need to tell you. All of us are doing something with our anxiety, aren't we? Oh, two of us. Listen, Rich Villoda said week 1 on April 24th, to be human is to be anxious. We are all experiencing to some degree anxiety, and we're all doing something with our anxiety. Knowing this is true, I'm going to start right here. We must make sure we lead our anxiety to the right place rather than our anxiety leading us to the wrong place. Now, seriously, this is how I want to I'm going to try to give you lots of handles and tools today. So this overarching thing is that I want to direct you. I want to tell you, we need to make sure our anxiety is not leading us to the wrong place. And here's what happens. Anxiety is so powerful, isn't it? It's so strong. It seems like it's left us without any choice other than to be led by that anxiety in chains. But here's the reality. No matter how strong your anxiety feels, you do not have to be led by it. You're actually called to lead it. But you're doing something with your anxiety. I'm doing something with my anxiety as well. And what I want to give you today is a real hopeful invitation. And the reason that I tell you it's a hopeful invitation is because it comes from someone who used to be so chronically anxious, who used to be so overreactive, who used to always speak without ever thinking, who allowed his mind to go faster than it was created to go, who allowed his heart to race faster than his heart was created to race. Anybody know what that's like, to have a mind that goes faster than it's supposed to go? A heart that's going faster, and just the sense of I'm losing all control? Well, today what I want to do is show you the story of Peter, and this is a real interesting angle. And so you're like, oh, I know Peter's story. Today you're going to hear it taught, I think, because I've never taught it this way. You're going to hear it taught in a fresh way around the idea of anxiety. And here's how I want to play it out. I want to go to 1 Peter 5, so if you have a Bible, you can turn there. And what I'm going to do is give you a vision that Peter gives us for living a non-anxious life. And then we're going to rewind a bit and show all of his chronic anxiety on display. And we're going to try to figure out, could I make the transformation journey in my anxiety like Peter did, so that like Peter, I too might become a non-anxious presence. Anybody want to be a non-anxious presence? Anybody want to be in the midst of conflict and not freak out? Anybody want to have someone attacking you from both sides and be able to stand your ground? Because that is what we need in today's world, by the way. We need parents, and we need leaders, and we need workers, and we need employees, and we need church leaders, and we need volunteers, and we need people, period, to be able to stand their ground, knowing who they are in Jesus and not being swayed by all the activity and reactivity and anxiety within our culture. Guys, there's a lot of anxiety out there. I know also there's some in here, so let's work through it. Today, would you stand with me? I want to give you Peter's vision It's hopeful because remember, you're going to read the words of a man who used to be so chronically anxious, a man who was so emotionally reactive rather than responding thoughtfully when he found himself in difficult circumstances. And here are these beautiful words. I love the words of this text in 1 Peter 5. This is about 30 years after what we're going to read about Peter in the gospel. So it's some 30 years since he's been the anxious guy. Here's what we read. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. Now, anybody want to know where's the cutoff for younger and elders? Anybody else? I recently read a great book on the second half of life called From Strength to Strength. It was a great book by Arthur Brooks. I told my friend about this, and he said, Ben, you don't need to be reading that. You're not in the second half of life. I'm doing the math. I'm like, bro, I am. I mean, I'm all about going past 90, but if not, I'm in the second half. It's okay. So wherever you are on that younger or elder, all of you, okay, not just the younger, not just the older, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. This is us together, guys, because God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. If you want to know what does God despise and what does God love, boom. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him. Why? Because he cares for you. But be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, you have one. The devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. That's what anxiety does, but someone's behind that. Resist him. There it is, standing firm in the faith. That's a non-anxious presence, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you, and here it is, make you strong, firm, and steadfast. Anybody want those words to describe you? Same. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. You may be seated. There is so much here, and I want to just give you this question out of the text. Can you even imagine yourself becoming a non-anxious person? Can you even imagine in your wildest dreams, can you even picture yourself being in the kind of settings right now that paralyze you with anxiety and not being anxious about it? I've got a long way to go, but I think back to my early days of leadership. I called it a lot of other things, but looking back and having the right terminology now, it was just me reacting out of my anxiety. But if you can't quite imagine yourself becoming a non-anxious person, I want you to know that it's highly likely that Peter was not able to imagine himself becoming a non-anxious person. When you see Peter on the pages of the 4 Gospels, what you see is so much anxiety, so much reactivity. Who always spoke up first when Jesus asked a question without thinking? Peter. The answer is Peter, by the way. We're not going to fake you guys out, okay? Ready? All right, it's Peter. Who's the one that always made bold promises to Jesus that he couldn't keep? Peter. Right? Who is the one that denied Jesus 3 times? All right. It's Peter. Now, I want to show you a few places in the Gospels where these things took place. The first one is in Matthew 16:22. But what I want you to do is, even if you've heard these words before, I want you to think through the lens of anxiety, being an anxious person versus a non-anxious person. So in Matthew 16:22, Jesus has just said to his disciples, guys, here's the plan. For me to complete my mission, I'm going to have to die. And Peter's like, no, you're not. Matthew 16:22, Peter took him, Jesus, aside. Can you ever imagine taking Jesus aside? Like, come here, young man. He took Jesus aside and said these words, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Why is Peter doing this? Guys, he's anxious. Peter had a plan, and he wanted to control the plan. And if you think you're in control of the plan and someone else tries to disrupt your plan, it doesn't matter if they're your mom, dad, children, pastor, small group leader, or apparently Jesus himself, you're going to tell him that's not the plan. We're not going to do it like this. That's what Peter's saying to Jesus. But it wasn't just in those kinds of moments. There's this scene where Jesus wants to take Peter and James and John up a mountain. And Jesus is going to be transfigured before them. And what Jesus wanted Peter to do is just behold his glory. But Peter, you have that person in your group or on your team or in our church who they can never just enjoy the silence? Watch this, Matthew 17:4. Jesus is like, watch this. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you want me to, I will put up 3 shelters. You can count on me, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Right? He's just like all up in his feelings. And if you don't see this through the lens of anxiety, you're missing something. He's like, I got to do something. right? Think about Martha and Mary. Do you remember that story? Even if you're not much of a Bible person, you probably know that story. Like Martha's going, what is Mary doing? She should be doing something like me. But if you see it through the lens of anxiety, what you realize is Martha's trying to please Jesus, and so she's so anxious, she can't even enjoy Jesus being there. And Mary's like, I'm listening. Martha's like, there's something wrong with you. And Jesus is like, no, she's chosen what is better. And then you have that moment where Jesus is getting arrested, and all of the other gospel writers besides John, they tell us that one of the disciples cut someone's ear off. John, who tells us in the Easter story that he's faster than Peter, also outs Peter on being the one who cut the guy's ear off. Look at John 18:10. This is serious reactivity, serious anxiety. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword. Let's just stop right there. Came into the office Tuesday, and it wasn't too surprising. I had my one-on-one meeting with Ben Lee, who's so fun that Ben's on our staff team along with Lindsay now. And Ben's like, hey, man, so we saw a guy with a machete when we were walking downtown today. I was like, I bet I will beat that by lunch. I mean, it was almost lunch. You know, it's crazy. He's like, Peter, what are you doing with a sword? Like, I don't understand. You know, Jesus sends the disciples out. And he's like, don't take money. Don't take extra clothes. Peter's like, but I can, the sword? And he cut, and not only does John tell us that it was Peter, he even tells us who the person's ear was that got cut off. It was Malchus. Do you see the reactivity caused by his anxiety? Do you see the reactivity caused by, oh my gosh, I'm out of control now, and I've got to do something to rein back in control? You want to know why violence happens in so many spaces? It's about control. It's about, and the people who tend to get the biggest, those are people who are usually afraid of losing control, afraid of losing power, afraid of losing resources. They're just afraid. And one of the things you see with Peter, and I want to ask you about, is Peter's anxiety, it caused him to get bigger. Now, this is really important. If you don't take care of your anxiety, it's either going to cause you to get bigger or smaller. And here's the question I want to ask you. Does your anxiety tend to cause you to get bigger or smaller? Let me tell you what I mean by bigger or smaller. And by the way, there's not a third option, and it's an all play. You don't have to answer out loud, although it'd be kind of fun. I mean, some of you I know so well, I can tell you if you get bigger or smaller. And those of you who know me well could tell me the same. Anyway, so to get bigger means you're intense. You're reacting in anger. You're talking fast. You're cutting people down, and you don't even know why you're doing it. You feel like you've just got to do something, and so you get kind of ragey. You're what they call in those moments, you're a bull in a china shop. Bigger. Smaller, though, that's the route some of you take with your anxiety, and smaller looks like you stay silent, you shrink, or you hide. So now that you've heard kind of a difference in what is what, I want you to think about, does your anxiety cause you to get bigger or smaller? And the reason you will do yourself a favor to answer this question is because once you know the answer, you'll see it happening, and hopefully you can take a breath, pray a prayer, and allow God to show you, wait, hey, Ben, you're getting bigger. You're rising up against your kid who didn't do what you asked them to do. Ben, you're getting bigger. The person who wrote you that email, you're wanting to destroy them. That's not what we want to do, Ben. Or you may say, you know what, you're getting smaller. You're shying away from something that you need to say. You're shrinking back. You're hiding. And so it's good to think about that. Does your anxiety cause you to get bigger or to get smaller? And then Peter's anxiety goes on. I want to show you a couple of things that happen near the end of Jesus' life. One of them is this moment where Jesus says to the disciples, all of you are going to walk away. Now, I'm probably like Peter in this moment. Like, nuh-uh, I'm not going to walk away. You can count on me. Listen to what Peter says in verse 33 of Matthew 26. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Jesus, even if those 11 walk away, I'm your boy, right? If everyone else deserts you, I'm with you. The very next verse that I won't show you on the screen is Jesus saying to Peter, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. You think Peter's going to be cool with that? You think Peter's going to think before he speaks? Verse 35 of Matthew 26. But Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Now watch this so you know how to spot your own anxiety. The very anxiety that causes Peter to make bold promises to Jesus is the same anxiety that causes Peter to tell the servant girl, I don't know this man. Do you see how it's the same anxiety but two drastically extreme differences? On the one hand, I got you because he's so anxious. On the other hand, he's calling down curses. I don't know this man. I don't know this man. I was not with this man. Which is it, Peter? He's like, I don't know. I'm so up in my anxiety that I just go with whatever seems like it'll fix the moment with whoever I'm with. So Jesus, I'm your guy all the way. Over here, I don't even know this guy. So the question you've got to ask is, what is your anxiety causing you to do? What is it making you do? Peter, up until this point, he does not know what it's like to be anything other than an anxious presence. Peter has not learned how to be calm. He has not learned how to be at ease. Peter faced a dilemma that we all face. Tell me if you can relate. Here's the dilemma. We are always going to cast our anxiety somewhere. If you've not been taking notes, I would just urge you, this is the point to get in the game. Because you're going to get something that will help you on Tuesday, not just feel good on a Sunday. The dilemma Peter faced is the same one that you and I face. We are always casting our anxiety somewhere. Listen to the meaning of this verb that gets translated cast in our text in verse 7 for the day. This word cast, in the Greek, it literally means this: to throw something upon someone or on something else. This is a huge image that you need to get. It is so helpful for me already. So to cast our anxiety means there's something on us or in us, and we're throwing it somewhere. And you are throwing it somewhere. You know this, right? Every person watching online, everyone in this room, we're casting our anxiety somewhere. And here's the thing. If you are not casting your anxiety on God, you're either only casting it on yourself and or other people. And here's what I'm going to tell you. If we don't learn how to cast our anxiety on God, we're going to destroy ourselves and we're going to destroy other people. So if you're casting it on yourself, you'll know this feeling, but let me just describe it for you. If you cast your anxiety on you, what that feels like is a ton of pressure, doesn't it? What that feels like is never doing enough. What that feels like is me feeling guilty that I'm not stronger, more powerful, more skillful, more gifted, that I don't have more time. Why? Because I'm casting it on me. I'm putting, Ben, you got to do this. You got to do something about this. Or I cast it on someone else. I cast it on other people. That looks like blame. That looks like trying to dominate or be superior to other people. Think about where you're casting your anxiety whenever you don't cast it on God. You're either casting it on yourself or maybe in addition to you, you're also casting it on other people. Who gets the brunt of your anxiety? Oftentimes, it's not the people who are responsible for it. Who loses in your life when you don't take your anxiety to God? Start thinking of spouse, children, friends, roommates, neighbors, coworkers. Steve Cuss, who I've told you has been so helpful for me about this whole anxiety thing, especially with leadership stuff, he says that our anxiety, this is a big one, it's a lot of help for me, hopefully it'll help you. He said our anxiety can reside in 4 spaces. Anxiety can reside in 4 spaces. Here they are: the space within me, the space between me and you, the space within you, and the space between you and another. So I want you to think about your anxiety in life. It always is in one of these 4 spaces. I'm anxious because of what's going on in me. I'm anxious because there's something with the space between me and B. I'm anxious because of what's going on inside her, and I can even be anxious about what's going on between her and Janet. Does that make sense? So it's been so helpful for me to learn these lessons, and here's why. You know where we typically try to take responsibility for? Which spaces? We typically try to take responsibility for all 4 spaces. But you know what space you should take responsibility for? The space within you and your part in the space between you and another. But I can get anxious about what's going on between Lindsay and Minnie. I can get anxious about, what's going on between somebody else and somebody else. It doesn't mean I can't care, but it does mean, man, if I'm anxious for all the things I have no control over, I will be anxious forever. Here's what you need to know. Too often, we take responsibility for what we have no control over. Too often, you and I take responsibility for what we have no control over. It doesn't mean we shouldn't care, so don't get the teaching wrong today. But it does mean that we need to figure out a way to do something with our anxiety so that we don't destroy ourselves or other people. Now, even if you're new to this term, a non-anxious presence, like I was probably 4 years ago, what I know is that you want to be one, don't you? I mean, wouldn't you love to be in a moment of conflict and not lose your mind? Anybody that naturally has a hot temper like your pastor, would you love to be in a moment where someone's screaming at you and you don't scream back? Or take your sword out like Peter? So there's some great verses in our text, but what do they have to do with each other? I mean, we're reading about humility, we're reading about anxiety, we're reading about the devil, we're reading about suffering, we're reading about restoration. There's something in there about a mighty hand. Like, what in the world? What do they have to do with each other? Like, does humility have anything to do with anxiety, or is Peter having two separate thoughts? Here's what it has to do with, and this has been a huge learning as well. Here it is. Anxiety can be a form of pride. It doesn't seem like it, so I'm going to walk us through it. But anxiety can be a form of pride. Let's start with what pride is, and then let's figure out how that can become anxiety in our lives. Pride is me putting myself at the center. Pride is me taking credit for everything good in my life and everything, let's be honest, good in your life because of me. Pride means that I am the sole source and provider for my life. Okay, so that's pride. And that looks okay as long as you're into things that you can deliver to yourself and for yourself. But here's where it goes into anxiety. Pride means I'm the source and provider for everything I need in life. But then what happens if I'm depending on myself and I walk into a scene that I cannot provide for myself? Here's how I want to say it to you. This is really helpful too. Watch my hands. Anxiety comes when there's a gap between what I'm expecting from myself and what I'm actually able to do. Anybody ever been anxious in that space? Every one of us. If you don't know, like if there's ever a space between what you're expecting from yourself and what you can do, and it's all on you and you're prideful about it, anxiety is always going to live there. So anxiety can be a form of pride. But we want peace. So understand where peace comes from. Peace comes when there's no gap between what we're expecting from God and what God is actually able to do. Are you with me? Guys, this is huge. This is huge. Anxiety, even though you don't feel prideful because anxious, you feel humiliated, you actually might have a form of pride. You don't have to be the sole source for everything good that happens in your life. And then Peter tells us this: God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Which one of those do you want? God is your opponent or God giving favor to your life? That wasn't rhetorical. I thought, surely everyone wants the favor of God over their lives. See, Peter knew what it was like to try to live above the mighty hand of God. When he told Jesus, no, Lord, he's trying to rise above the hand of God. Peter knew what it was like to live outside of the hand of God. I'll do it. You can count on me. Peter knew what it was like to try to be the mighty hand in his own life. And then he tells us in this text, some 30 years later, guys, I've learned some secrets. I've learned some secrets. And the question we need to answer is this one: are there good reasons to cast all of your anxiety on God? Are there good reasons, not churchy reasons, not religious reasons, not like, I like that cliche reason, but are there actual good reasons for you to cast all of your anxiety on God? If you say, I don't think so, Ben, then I'm going to try to teach you in the next few minutes why you should. But if you say, yes, Ben, there are good reasons to cast my anxiety on God, all of it, then I want to ask you this: then why aren't you? Really? There are lots of good reasons for us to cast our anxiety on God, but there are two given to us in the text that I want to spell out for you because I think they're enough. You see, if you ever want help from anyone in any arena of life, there are two questions you need to answer. Only two questions. Here they are. Number one is, does this person have the ability to help me? And number two, do they want to help me? It really is that simple. And what Peter is telling us, the good reasons to cast all of our anxiety on God, is that he has the ability, he has a mighty hand, and that he cares for us. He has the ability to do it, and he wants to do it. Now, which one is harder for you to believe, really? That he has the ability or that he wants to? Let me tell you where I land on this. I have no doubt in God's ability. Sometimes, though, I haven't convinced myself that he cares for me. Guys, girls, listen. it is both easier for me to believe God has the ability to do whatever, and for me, it is easier for me to believe that he cares deeply for every single one of you. But I sometimes find it hard that he cares for me. Am I alone? But what would change if I would remind myself that this is the God who cares for me? Jesus said, Ben, you're more valuable than all of these other things. Your Father loves you. You had a great earthly father. Your heavenly Father loves to blow that out of the water and give you good gifts. He wants to help us, and he can help us. And then Peter goes along and he says that the devil is out to devour us. We need to be aware that the devil wants us to trust anyone besides God. You know that, right? He wants you to trust yourself. He wants you to trust other people who don't have your best interest at heart. He wants you to trust the dominant themes and narratives in our world. He just wants you to do anything besides trust God. Because he knows as long as you don't trust God, there's going to be anxiety in your life. And as long as you have anxiety, you won't even be able to focus on the purpose that God's created you to live with. And so Peter says, instead, stand firm in the faith. Be a non-anxious presence. Stand firm in your faith. Become this non-anxious presence. Guys, there's a ton of anxiety in our world. Would you agree with me? Go back and do some research if you want to. Just see from the moment the smartphone, quote, smartphone came out, what happened with anxiety. It's literally off the charts. It'll blow your mind. And I'm not talking about Christian research, just general research in our world. It will blow your mind what's happened to the level of anxiety. But I don't have to tell you about reports because you lived it. And I don't mean you've lived it with your friend. I mean you've lived it with you. I get it. Same. This is why I'm passionate about getting us a way out, no longer being led by our anxiety, but actually leading it where we want it to go. And that's what Peter's trying to get us to do. Peter lived so much of his life being led by his anxiety, but in 1 Peter 5, he's telling us how to lead our anxiety to a different place that's going to rescue us from being paralyzed by that same anxiety. Listen to what Peter Steinke, he wrote a book called Uproar about non-anxious leadership, and he writes this. He says, the non-anxious presence responds, which means he exercises thoughtfulness instead of reacting, a mindless action. Under conditions of extreme anxiety, most people become an anxious presence, lacking restraint and acting on impulse. Does that describe any world that you live in today? Guys, people have lost their minds. And many of us have lost our minds. When I see my reactivity and when I see so much of your reactivity, if you want to stand out in the world we live in today, it's going to take someone who can finally stand firm. It's going to take someone to be a non-anxious presence. I mean, listen to me really closely right here. Do you know what our anxious children need? They need non-anxious parents. Do you know what your anxious team at the office needs? They need you to be a non-anxious manager. Do you know what our church needed through the last 2 years from their pastor? I didn't always get it right, but I knew they needed me to be a non-anxious pastor. You know what your small group needs? A non-anxious small group leader. You know what your friends need, your spouse needs, your kids need, your parents need? You know what the rest of our Epic Church community needs? You know what your neighborhood needs? You know what our city needs? They need someone, because you will stand out if you do it, who just stands there firm in their conviction, is not saying, Jesus, you can count on me, and I don't know who Jesus is, going, no, I know who Jesus is, I'm staying connected to you, but I'm not going to allow your anxiety to get me all worked up. And if that happens to you, they will begin to ask you at the office and in your neighborhood and in your home and in this church community, tell me the secret. When everyone else think they're going to solve the world through outrage, by the way, no one has solved the world. When everyone else is getting on their feeds for 4 or 5 hours a day so that they can find peace, and yet they find the opposite of peace, I'm just telling you, you will stand out in a world who's being blown to and fro by the winds of society and division and politics and oh my gosh, and the stock market, now we have to be anxious. You don't have to be anxious unless you're outside the mighty hand of God. And if you're outside his hand and you've lived your whole life there and you want to stay there, just enjoy anxiety being a close and constant companion forever. But you've been given another way. You've been invited into something new. Now listen, when we're talking about being a non-anxious presence, listen again from Steinke. He writes, the influencing potential of the non-anxious presence is not to be confused with being cool or being nice, nor is it to be construed as denying anxiety in ourselves as if unaffected by events. The non-anxious presence invokes engagement, being there, listen, this is huge, taking the heat if need be, witnessing the pain, and yet not fighting fire with fire. Do you know that we don't have to react to everyone's reaction? Everybody know that? Do you realize you're not advancing the mission of God in the world with your social media posts predominantly? Do you realize that? I know it's like, no, Ben, this is effective. It's bringing me peace and changing the world. And Ben, the people who think like I do, let me know, and the other people, they don't follow me, but we're changing the world. When you and I feel the onset of anxiety, I think there are two invitations, and they both matter, and they're both legitimate. The first one is to just let anxiety lead you, and here's what will lead you. Thinking fast, losing control, speaking, having a heart rate that keeps going up and up and up and up. You can do that. That's maybe default for us. But I think the other invitation is this right here. It's not to get rid of anxiety. It's this. Here it is. God, I feel anxious about this. I feel like I want to get bigger or I want to get smaller. I feel like I want to fight that person. I don't know when we're at church, so no one's ever felt like we wanted to fight anybody. But God, rather than me being the mighty hand over my life, I'm going to come under your mighty hand. I know the stock market's going crazy. I know I've got to fire people this week. I know my kid's going off to college 2,000 miles away. I know there are plenty of good reasons for me to be anxious if you're not in my story. But God, I'm not going to be out here outside of your hand. I'm going to come under your hand. I'm going to humble myself. And you promised that in due time you would lift me up. And I am staking my earthly life and my eternity on that. And some of you aren't. Some of you are Christians and you're actually not trusting God for your life. He is bigger than the stock market. He's bigger than the office thing. He's bigger than my son going a long way away from home. He can handle it. He can handle it. But our reactivity is not helping us. Proverbs 15:18 says, a hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the one who is patient calms a quarrel. I know what it's like to be the hot-tempered person, but I want to become the calm, non-anxious presence. Anybody else? Here's what happens, and a lot of the books that I've read for this series have helped me so much over the last couple of years, and I can always email those to you. But what happens is, with everyone else's anxiety and all of their reactivity, we typically do one of two wrong things. We either get enmeshed or entangled with them in their anxiety, or we detach ourselves from it. Let me show you the real brief definition of each of those. To be enmeshed means that you are an anxious presence. To be detached means that you are a non-anxious absence. God has called you and I to be in this world, but not get tangled all up in this world. What we need to be is differentiated. Somewhat of a new word for me over these years. Let me tell you what differentiation is according to Steve Cuss. Differentiation is the ability to be fully yourself while being fully connected to people. Think about those spaces. It's gaining clarity on where I end and the other begins. A differentiated person allows space between herself and another, even when that other person is highly anxious or asking for a rescue. A differentiated leader is clear on her own values and convictions and is not easily swayed from them. She stands firm in her faith. Now, I told you the answer for everything is Peter, but we're going to change it up this time. Who do you think the most differentiated human to ever walk planet Earth is? Jesus. But who do you think I want to tell you learn their own differentiation from Jesus? Peter. I'm going to give you a verse I've loved for a lot of years, but I've never seen it through the lens of anxiety versus a non-anxious presence. In 1 Peter 2:23, talking about Jesus, Peter gives us these beautiful words. And he's telling us we can become like this. Here's what he says. When they hurled or cast their insults at him, at Jesus, he did not retaliate. When they hurled their insults, save yourself, King of the Jews. If you're the Son of God, come off the throne. I don't know about you, but I would have been worked up. He did not retaliate. When he suffered, is there a more anxiety-inducing moment in all of history than suffering on a cross for nothing you did wrong? When he suffered, he made no threats. He did not say things like, I'm going to get you back. Here come the angels that I promised you I could bring down. No, he's saying things like this, Father, forgive them. They don't even know. They don't even know. I'm not taking this to heart, God. I'm dying for the sins of the world. I am not going to threaten them. I'm not going to retaliate. What is his secret? His secret comes at the end of this verse. Instead, he entrusted himself to who? To this world that's so anxious, to his enemies, to his opponents. Instead, he just kept entrusting himself to the one he knew judges justly. You know what he did, to use Peter's chapter 5 language? He came under the mighty hand of God. He came, you're like, Ben, he's dying. They are brutalizing him. Yes, and he's going, I'm under the hand of God, because do you remember when Peter said, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God? Do you remember what he promised would happen on the backside of that? Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will what? He will lift you up in due time. So Good Friday, he's humbling himself on the cross under the mighty hand of God. It looks like it's over. But in due time, 3 days later, he's being literally lifted up by the mighty hand that he came under. This can be your story. This can be your reality. I don't care how young or old. I don't care if you've never been a person of faith, or you've walked away from your faith, or before you heard this message, you thought you had faith, but honestly, you're trying to hold yourself up. You don't have a mighty hand, and you don't have to. You are casting your anxiety somewhere, and you can quit casting it on your spouse or your pastor, amen, or your friend, or society, or your school, or the other political party. My gosh, you and I can live under the mighty hand of God, where we don't have to be so reactive. We can say with Peter, no, I'm humbling myself, and rather than throwing my anxiety on myself, or on my friends, or on my family, I'm going to throw it into the hands of the one who can do something about it and care so deeply for me. When we walk out of these doors in a moment, some of you are going to be briefly inspired, and you're going to go back to a life that's the same. And I want to warn you with my last words today, don't do that. God's ready to meet you in your seat. We can make this an altar right here. Some of you have called yourself Christian, but you've never put yourself in the hands of God, which means you're not. But you can be today. Others of you, you are a believer in Jesus Christ. You are a follower of Jesus, but you're living outside of his mighty hand, and anxiety is crippling you. And that would be bad enough if it was ruining your life, but it's ruining the life of your wife. It's ruining the life of your kids. It's ruining the life of people in this community, because what every anxious group needs is someone to step up and be a non-anxious presence who stands firm in their faith. And I need you to know, I'm not going to get this right either, but I intend, and our staff team talks a lot about this behind closed doors, we intend to be leaders who lead you by not reacting to everything you want us to react to, but to keep you centered on Jesus, living under the mighty hand of God. And we're going to give ourselves to that for your sake, because there's too much at stake. But what we would love is for a lot of you to join us in becoming a non-anxious presence. It'll stand out in here. It will certainly stand out there. So, what do you need to bring under the mighty hand of God today? What do you need to believe? That he can do something about your situation, or that he actually wants to? Would you pray with me? Today, if today's the day where you realize you've never done what we just read about Jesus, you've never entrusted yourself to the one on the throne, you can do that today. You don't have to be responsible for everything in your life. When there's a gap, God wants to close that gap and say, listen, while you were still a sinner, Christ died for you. God demonstrated his love by sending Jesus in your place so that your life could come under his mighty hand. And for the rest of us, I do want to say, just the space right in front of the stage, we just wanted to say, hey, we want to make this an altar before God, just to say, God, I've been so anxious. I've gotten bigger, or I've gotten smaller. God, I've been casting my anxiety on myself and over those people that actually mean the most to me. But God, today I want to throw it on you, because you can handle it and because you care for me. So God, would you meet us in this space? Would you do something for us? I want to just open this altar. Guys, you can go ahead and stand if you want to respond. But is there anything that you need to go, hey, I want to get under your mighty hand. I'm having to do some things at work this week that make me anxious. Go ahead and stand. There's a war in Ukraine I'm still so anxious about. There's this thing going on in our culture that I'm so anxious. There's all of these injustices that are legit, and they're making me so anxious. Guys, could we come and just throw it on him today? He cares for us. He has power to do something about it. And this space is open as we sing and respond.